Welcome to HughSecCon's Track 3. Our third talk this morning is the 7 Tenets of Threat Intelligence Operations. Our next speaker has over 25 years of experience in cybersecurity as a practitioner and leader. He recently was made the VP analyst at Gartner, where he covered security operation topics including SIEM, SOAR, MDR, DFIR, and SOX. Please help me welcome Toby Bussa.
Thanks, everyone. So thanks for coming out. Today we're going to talk about the 7 tenets of threat intelligence operations. Again, a little more about me. How many people are from Pearland? Anyone? Okay. Anyway, so I grew up in Pearland. When I lived there, I don't know if you've been there recently, but when I lived there, one of my clearest memories was the city limit sign. Population was just north of 6,000. So totally dated myself there, but it's slightly larger now. Again, I've got over 25 years in cybersecurity. I've been an active practitioner, so I've led SecOps teams, I've done data protection management, I've run architecture and engineering teams, done merger and acquisition, divestiture security for a year, and also third-party risk management. I spent about 6 years at Gartner as an analyst, and then I pivoted over to doing product marketing, where I currently the VP of product marketing at Threat Connect. So I want to start off first by kind of placing the situation, which is what exactly is threat intelligence operations. It's probably not a term that you've heard of, hopefully you have, but there's a couple of different factors, and really the way I look at this is it's covering people, process, technology, organization, construct. And so one of the things that has bothered me as a practitioner for so many years is that threat intelligence is always kind of deemed to be non-essential or not that important. And I've run security teams and security operations centers. I've built SOCs, and threat intelligence was always kind of like there is more of a supporting function of the security operations center, and kind of buried down in the organization. And so one of the constructs around threat intelligence operations is to actually elevate the team higher in the organization. Again, give it more prominence instead of it being lower level in the organization. So this is kind of one of the organizational constructs. It's aligning to modern tradecraft. So, threat intelligence kind of stems out of the physical security space and kind of the defense space over the last 20 years. But, I think some of the tradecraft is definitely aging, right? So I think in terms of what we define as threat intelligence operations requires a mindset shift in terms of the tradecraft and the processes that are utilized. And we'll touch on all these across the presentation. And then it's putting CTI at the core of security operations, at the core of cyber risk, basically the activities that may fall under a CISO. It's giving, again, not just prominence from an organizational perspective or giving it a new name, it's actually giving it emphasis inside the organization and actually, again, aligning it to all these other functions. So the 7 tenets of TI Ops came about when we were thinking about, kind of how does cyber threat intelligence and the function and the investments around that actually become more modern. And I like tenets. I think they're kind of a nice construct in terms of being able to give a set of guideposts or wayposts in terms of it. If you see what a North Star is, you need some way of finding your way there. And the tenets help do that, right? And so this is kind of it's not a checklist that you achieve, it's a set of goals, it's a set of success measures that allow an organization to take kind of a legacy cyber threat intel capability or function and evolve that and modernize it and make it more relevant to the organization. So we're going to go through each one of these in more depth. So the first tenet is it elevates threat intelligence to a mandatory, critical security operations role. And so I touched on that at the beginning in terms of what that looks like. And again, it is an elevation of the CTI team. So and this isn't just saying, again, we're going to give it a name change or we're just going to change the reporting hierarchy. It's much bigger than that because you have to look at it holistically. You have to look at it across people, across process, across the services that you're leveraging, across technology. And so threat intelligence operations encompasses this concept of really modernizing how you approach cyber threat intelligence. And then once you do that, then it's ripe for actually giving it more prominence and more, more importance inside the organizations. And so we call it the intelligence-powered security ops organization. So this may look kind of like cyber fusion. It is a similar concept to that, where threat intelligence is really a keystone function of the organization. And that's important because cyber threat intelligence obviously has a lot of value that it can offer to the organization, but historically it's kind of been viewed again as something that only supports maybe the security operations center. People struggle to actually kind of connect the dots between, well, what can cyber threat intel do for cyber risk management? What can it do for incident response? How can it help the offensive security? Certainly the defensive side of things has been covered pretty well, but there's all these other functions. Identity and access management, for example, all these areas that ultimately roll up under the CISO are ripe to have cyber threat intelligence help them, right? It's an enabling function. So one of the other concerns, one of the other challenges that we see is like, that's great, okay, I'm gonna put cyber threat intel at the center of everything we do. It's gonna help enable all these other functions inside the organization. But the way organizations have approached cyber threat intel actually impedes that from happening. And what I mean by that is, cyber threat intel may be a function, but it's being done in a very disconnected and disorganized way. So instead of having a single source of cyber threat intel truth, an organization may turn on the threat intel feeds in their SIM, for example, or they may have an analyst who's looking at unstructured open source intel on a daily basis, taking things they're finding from blogs and other news sources and writing a report, right? But they're doing this in a very disconnected and disjointed way. And so that gives, ultimately the adversary an advantage when they know an organization's already disconnected. It's like, oh, they've got some threat intel over here, threat intel over here. This concept of intelligence-powered security ops really does take that advantage away from the adversary, because you're unifying the source of threat intelligence. It becomes a single source of truth for the organization, and that has a lot of benefits because then you can align it to cyber risk. You can use it to get consistent coverage across your threat detection and prevention technologies. It can help you with your mean time to detect and your mean time to respond. So tenet number 2, and this is some of the tradecraft. It requires an evolved threat intelligence lifecycle, one that emphasizes the planning and requirements and the use of threat intel by consumers. So how many of you are familiar with the traditional cyber threat intel lifecycle, right? Okay. It's good, don't get me wrong, right? I mean, it definitely, I like processes. I'm a Six Sigma green belt, so processes are awesome. But this is lacking. And in conversations we have with a lot of organizations, what we find is, if you look at this and you kind of give it some scrutiny, you see that, okay, you plan, you collect intel, you process the intel, you do some analysis, and then dissemination is this one little box in the upper left quadrant, and then feedback, sometimes it's bolted on to this life cycle, sometimes you'll see it as dissemination and feedback. A lot of times feedback doesn't exist. It's just kind of this concept that floats out of there. And so we call this the legacy threat intel lifecycle because it is kind of past its prime, and it doesn't really help CTI teams, and it certainly doesn't help the customers. And so we put out the evolved threat intelligence lifecycle, which is similar, right? It's an evolution of the traditional CTI lifecycle, but there's some very important differences, and this plays into the role of how an organization evolves their tradecraft to move from kind of traditional CTI functions to threat intel ops. And the first of that is it explicitly acknowledges the fact that there's two parties here. There's the CTI team, and they're effectively the producers. They're the ones who are responsible for all that stuff in the legacy life cycle. But there has to be someone consuming the intel, right? We hear from a lot of organizations that say, yeah, we produce all this great intel, but no one does anything with it. Like, we struggle to find people who want to use it and want to leverage it, and that's really frustrating because right, that it kind of makes you like, okay, well, are we doing something that's valuable? Does it have value to the organization? And so we definitely need to be thinking about the consumers in this equation. it takes into account action, and that's really one of the the core things about the TI ops concept, is that threat intelligence isn't just produced for the sake of producing it. It has to have relevance, it has to be actionable, and it has to be actionable and relevant to the consumers. And so again, it needs to be leveraged for prevention, detection, and response. It needs to be able to enable leadership to make better decisions. These are the stakeholders, these are the consumers. And the dissemination and integration stages and the feedback and validation stages are prominent here because they are the two bridges between the producer and the consumer. And these are some of the places that we see organizations struggle with because they have intel, they're trying to give it to to the consumer. The question is, how do you disseminate that? And then processes only get better if there's actually feedback provided. So again, where it's historically been viewed as that bolt-on to the kind of legacy CTI lifecycle, we believe it actually has to have a prominent role in in this process, because if you're not getting feedback, if you're not hearing from the consumers, like, is the intel I'm producing of value to you? What could I do better? Then how do you get better? How do you improve? You can't. So we ran a survey with our CTI customers earlier in the year, and we asked them to rate the effectiveness of the planning and direction phase. And so again, this is one of those areas that is a big challenge for many organizations. And in our customer base, they basically said, no one said it was not effective, right, to actually focus on that phase of the life cycle. Very few actually said it was modestly effective, which I was kind of surprised at, but most actually said it was effective, highly effective, or exceptionally effective in terms of how they structure and how they organize their CTI function and the work that the CTI function does. So there is a lot of value in actually focusing on the planning direction phase as well. And so that brings us to tenet number 3, which is threat intelligence needs to be aligned and focused on the most critical risks to the business through a living set of requirements. And this concept of requirements is extremely important, but it's also one of the biggest challenges that we see organizations face, CTI teams face. So SANS every year, how many of you have you read their CTI survey? Okay, if you haven't, I'd go off and read it, because it's an awesome survey. There's a lot of great insights on it. So they've run this for a number of years. And they asked this one question: are CTI requirements clearly defined in your organization? And it's not that great. I mean, if you look at this, you kind of go, okay, well, in 2019, it was really bad. Last year, the report that came out this year was like a huge step up, because it basically went up one year and then it started coming down. And if you're involved in CTI, it's not good to see people not focusing on requirements and seeing that number dwindle. But then it shot up. It was almost 60% this year, which is great. But it's still only 60% that actually said, yes, we have documented requirements. Everyone else, 40%, are in some other stage around that. Either they're doing it ad hoc or they're just not doing it at all. And this is extremely problematic, because if you don't have requirements, then how are you actually kind of defining what you do? Like, what work and what intel are you going to produce? So if you don't do that and you're not aligning to the most critical threats or the most critical risks to the organization, you have a problem, right? And we do see teams, when we ask this question, it's like, well, how are you doing that? And they're like, well, we guess, or we make assumptions. We think are valid assumptions. So we're not actually going out and having that conversation with our stakeholders. We're going and kind of assuming that this is what they're going to want. Like, this is what this team needs. They're interested in maybe what attacks are happening in our particular sector, our particular industry. May not be true though, right? So this concept of actually defining requirements is a fundamental piece of that, whether it's the legacy or whether it's the evolved threat intel lifecycle, because it ultimately defines how an organization is going to produce the right intel for the right consumer, and how are they going to deliver value to the organization. And so, again, I like processes, and so this is almost like a sub-process of the evolved threat intel lifecycle. And again, it does take effort to do this, right? I mean, this isn't just jump in, buy a piece of technology, start trying to aggregate some cyber threat intel and see who's going to come asking for it. You really do have to put some effort into that, and it's not hard. It just takes effort. And so there is a way, this 5-step process that can be used, and it's pretty. I mean, if you look at it, you go, yeah, of course, right? This is pretty simplistic, but having these reminders and these constructs, I think, is actually important to make sure that you are thinking about, if you're developing a CTI program or trying to mature a CTI program into, say, a TI ops program, that you are thinking strategically about how you're going to generate the requirements, because they are the foundation for doing cyber threat intel. So then, again, as part of the survey, we asked customers, how helpful have priority intel requirements been in improving their CTI performance, and PIRs. Is a form of, it's probably the most common form of a CTI requirement. So it's what are the critical things that the CTI team needs to produce for a stakeholder. And all of them, except for one little slice, which again was a little surprising, almost everyone said, yeah, it's extremely or moderately important to to the CTI team's to their performance. So not having requirements puts you in a pretty big hole in terms of actually either building and implementing a CTI function or maturing it. So tenet number 4 is about not focusing solely on indicators of compromise, right? And that's what CTI is typically known for, right? Threat intelligence is all about an indicator. But that's not where things are going, because indicators have utility, don't get me wrong, but good CTI really expands beyond that and starts to look at the motivation, the tactics, techniques, the trends, the infrastructure and the tools that threat actors are using, right? So it's actually starting to go beyond just like, a laundry list of indicators and getting to something that actually is going to give you more insight and more value in terms of what the adversary or the threat actor is doing. How many people are familiar with David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain? Awesome. I love this, right? So basically, this is a nice construct in terms of looking at, if you're going to focus on different types of cyber threat intel and try to utilize that or put it into practice, how much pain do you inflict on the adversary? And so if you're looking at file hash values, for example, at the lowest level, everyone knows that these are pretty much trivial to bypass, right? You can basically recompile a executable with a code change and you have a new file hash. So if you're going to be blocking on file hashes and you think that's going to give you enough protection, you're not making the adversary's life very difficult, because they'll walk right around that. But you start to get up into things like the infrastructure that they're using, their tools. If you can start to understand the tooling that they're leveraging, their infrastructure, their command and control infrastructure, for example, and you start to take action against that, now you're actually causing some more. You're making the adversary work, right? And there's always this concept of if you make the challenge to the adversary more than more than the person next door to you. If they're sitting there, say it's a robber who's rattling locks, they're going to go to the easiest target, most likely, unless they really, really want something from you. So again, if you're going to make their life challenging and they're more the opportunistic attacker, they're going to go find someone who has weaker controls. When you get up into tactics, techniques, and procedures, now we're actually making their life really hard. When you understand the behaviors, you understand the motivations of the attacker, and you can actually adapt to that, then you're taking away most of their advantage that they rely on. And so I love this quote, again, from the SANS CTI survey, that, again, it just reinforces the function that indicators are good, right? There's solid utility in those. They're great, for doing, when they're high fidelity, they're great for doing blocking and tackling. But as a CTI function matures, they definitely need to not just rely solely on indicators. They need to be working up the pyramid of pain to make the adversary's life a lot more difficult. And so, how many people have read the book Good to Great? Jim Collins? Awesome book. And one of the big takeaways for me is this concept of the genius of the and, right? And I think this is certainly applicable to cyber threat intel, because it's not just about indicators, but it's also not just about attacker behaviors, their TTPs. It's about leveraging both. And this is ultimately the challenge that this tenet is really trying to tackle is you need both. And you, depending on your industry, depending on the requirements that you have, you do need to find a balance between, whether you're going to focus, a little more on indicators because maybe you're less mature and you need to bolster your defenses, or maybe you're higher up the maturity chain, but you need to think about, okay, now how do I incorporate more of the attacker behavior type of intelligence in there. And so, there is a maturity to getting to TI ops, right? There are, there's going to be organizations that are kind of at the bottom of the mountain. They have a few intel requirements, right? But they're starting there. They're asking the right questions. They're going out and talking to the stakeholders. They're going to start build and growing a threat library, that single source of truth. So they're going to stop operating in a disconnected fashion, and they're going to start, operating off of a single source. And they're going to focus on indicators. You have to start someplace, and indicators, again, have good utility. They have good value. But as you start to get more mature, the intel requirements grow, you're going to be talking to more stakeholders, you're going to be finding, kind of once the CTI function's been established, people start to gravitate towards it, and because they see like, oh, look, that function is there. That's cool. They're collecting this intel. I wonder what they can do for me. And so over time, as that organization happens, it's kind of, galaxies forming or planets forming. There's a level of gravity that the CTI team has, and so they'll get more stakeholders coming to them and asking them to do something for them, and they can build requirements around that. You're getting more procedures in place, but you're starting to incorporate adversary knowledge in there, right? So it's again starting to look at what the behaviors of the adversaries are and how you can actually communicate and how the stakeholders can leverage that intel. And then when you get to the top, this is where you're basically producing a bunch of different types of intel. You found the balance of indicators and adversary knowledge, but you notice it's not at the very, very top because I don't think anyone ever really completes that journey. It's always like that last bit up the hill definitely takes some time. So tenet number 5 is really about automating the work of the TI ops team. And so automation is permeating everything, right? I think everyone agrees to that. And the problem is that CTI, like other functions, suffers from some of the same challenges, right? There's a lot of kind of repetitive work. There's a lot of tasks that just have to be completed. I kind of refer to it that there's the same level of grunt work that the security operations, like your tier 1, tier 2 analysts are going to have in terms of here's a workflow and I have to follow this workflow, or here's how I have to process my intel. So there's if you haven't seen this article from John Moltzik, it's really good. He's got a couple of articles where he covered some of the findings from a survey that he did about CTI earlier in the year. I think these came out between May and July. But he found that 85% of security professionals believe the CTI program requires too many manual processes, right? So, okay, you're starting to build out a CTI team. You're starting to build out a CTI function. Manual processes are really going to impact that. And so I call this the good, the bad, and the ugly of automation. So, there are a lot of positives, right? So we see, security operations centers, for example, adopting orchestration and automation because, again, they suffer from some of the same things. Identity and access management teams have been automating things, for a long time. So it reduces the boring or repetitive work, and you get happier analysts, right? At the end of the day, you don't want analysts focusing on data processing. You don't want them focusing on, repetitive tasks that have very low value for the organization, and, to be fair, doesn't make their job very interesting. You want to get happier analysts, and so automation can help with that. It allows teams to go faster, right? We see organizations who are facing what I call the big data challenges in CTI. It's not just the security operations there. CTI teams are facing these big data challenges. They have a ton of volume. They have a velocity of intel coming in because there's a lot more intel these days than there was 10 years ago. The variety of intel is certainly challenging. You have to understand the veracity of the intel. You have to deal with this big data problem. How do you deal with that but actually accelerate the ability for the CTI team to process and get to the analysis and dissemination phases faster? It can act like a force multiplier, right? So again, automation is something where we do see CTI teams tend to be pretty small, in a lot of organizations. Automation is effectively a force multiplier. It allows you to kind of, once you, again, looking at the challenges, once you put the effort into it, because it does require some effort, it allows you to effectively, let one CTI analyst operate like three. And you get to be able to demonstrate ROI, right? That's another challenge for CTI teams is, okay, how do I demonstrate the value? How do I actually show the ROI for the organization? And automation, much like other places where it's being applied, allows that to happen. Now, there are some challenges, right? I think everyone's going to kind of think, and we're seeing this now with like generative AI coming out, everyone's starting to worry about the perceptions of automation and have negative perceptions. Is that going to take my job, right? Is automation going to reduce the value that I bring to the organization? I believe the opposite. I believe if you look at the positive, what it does is take away all the time-consuming activities and part of the job that's not fun and actually allows analysts to shine. It gives them the opportunity to do the stuff that they love, which is analyzing cyber threat intel and producing relevant intel that's going to make their customers happy. There are questions around is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Is it worth the effort to actually do this automation work? Because it does require upfront work, right? You just don't go in and start automating on necessarily on day one, particularly if you have custom processes. Again, we're too unique. We have too many unique processes. You do have to prime the pump. There is money and effort and time that has to be put into developing, whether it's playbooks for custom automations. And that comes back into that, it requires investment. So there is work that has to be done here, but net, the positives definitely will outweigh the challenges for an organization. So when we talk about automation, though, I think it's important to actually reflect that there are different kinds, right? There is this concept of built-in automation versus customized, right? So a lot of security tools, we don't really think about it these days. We just kind of take it for granted that automation happens, right? There's just stuff that happens in the background and it's, I don't necessarily see it, but it is a form of automation. And so, for an organization, when they say, I'm going to embrace automation for my, my cyber threat intel team, when you're looking at the technologies, it's important to consider how much of this stuff is built in. Which again, I think when you have very consistent, universal processes, like you have to process data, you have to normalize data, you have to remove duplicate data, that's universal. That just should be baked in. It is a form of automation. And I think it's worth acknowledging that. But then there is going to be the customized automation. Every organization has a different tech stack or a combination in their tech stack. They're going to have different processes. Those have to be considered as well. You also have to think about as a task versus a process, right? So a lot of work that is done is just these one-off tasks, right? They may be part of a bigger process or a bigger workflow, but that is a very big distinction. If you can start automating what a CTI analyst does just on a task level, that can take probably 80% of the pain off of them. And then you can start actually figuring out how to put those together and how do you actually tackle the bigger process automation. And then this concept of fully versus semi-automated, right? A lot of organizations, we're just going to fully automate everything. We're just going to, that's our goal. Well, it doesn't have to be, right? I mean, again, if you're able to take a process, you're able to automate 80% of it and get to semi-automation, that's fantastic, right? And there's going to be lots of processes and workflows and stuff that you do want a human involved in that. You don't want it just to be fully end-to-end. Maybe someday we'll get there, but I think in terms of especially acknowledging the role of the analyst where automation gets applied, you have to find that balance between what you need the analyst to do and what you want the machine automation to do. So tenet number 6 is it integrates and automates threat intel into every aspect of security and risk management, cyber risk management. And we think about this though because when you look at the scope of the cyber threat intel team, it's particularly when you start maturing into this TI ops idea, you do have to acknowledge that there's going to be different producers, different personas involved here that are going to be reflective of the different types of intel. And then there's going to be different consumers associated with that. So, if you're not familiar with cyber threat intel, there's typically 3, sometimes 4 that are referenced, which is operational, tactical, and strategic. And so operational is going to be more of your indicators of compromise. Tactical is going to be where you're going to start looking at, tactics, techniques, procedures, more of the behaviors. And strategic is where you're going to be looking at kind of the trends that are happening. Like, is ransomware growing? Is it growing in which sector? And each of those, you typically may have a different, it may be one person who's doing this, but they kind of have to wear different hats in the CTI function. And they're going to have different consumers. And those consumers, when you disseminate the information out to those consumers, may have different ways of that intel being disseminated. And so for an analyst, it may be a case. It may be an email. It may be a phone call, say like, hey guys, you need to look at this indicator. It's really important. When you talk about technologies though, this is where plugging in the tech stack into a threat intel platform is actually really important, because then you move from like machine to human or human to human into machine to machine, and this is what we mean by integration. And a lot of organizations struggle with that, right? They're still relying on, okay, I've done, I've built a single source of CTI truth. Everyone's starting to really operate off of common processes, but we're still picking up the phone, or we're still like sending a list to somebody and saying, hey, can you implement this list on the firewall so we can block these new indicators? Really, they need to be integrating the tech stack and taking advantage of the speed of machine-to-machine communication. But like at the tactical level, yeah, you may be actually producing a report or something explaining to, maybe the red team wants to launch a new campaign, and like, hey, we want, which threat actor is really active in our industry. We want to look at their tactics and techniques and understand those more, so we can actually mimic that when we run a campaign. So really, I call this the three rights that, in terms of disseminating and integrating intel into these different functions. Again, the goal is to be efficient and supply high fidelity threat intel. It's to the right stakeholder, in the right format, at the right time. And so kind of having this approach and keeping it in mind when you're thinking about building the requirements with a stakeholder, you have to ask these questions like, well, who is the stakeholder I'm producing this intel for? Is it executive who wants to know what the threat of the day is, or is it the intel that our EDR is going to consume? Has to be in the right format, right? Doesn't need to be in a report. Doesn't need to be in an email. Doesn't need to be in machine readable format. And when do they need it? Do they need it once a week? Do they need it every hour? So the last tenet is around measuring effectiveness and success for both the production and the consumption of threat intel in a way that it's understandable and relevant to the business. This, I think, is and I save this one for last because I'd say one of the number one challenge, maybe the number one challenge that we hear from organizations is that they may have invested in cyber threat intel, but they really struggle to show value. Every year budgets roll around and it's like, okay, where are we spending money? Okay, well, what has the cyber threat intel function done for me? Like I'm spending X amount of dollars every year. How if I need you to demonstrate to me what you've done for me, how are you doing that? And organizations struggle. And again, this is a quote from John Olczyk out of one of his articles from his survey, where 71% of security professionals said it's difficult to measure ROI of the CTI program. Full stop. This is a proverbial challenge, and until this is solved, CTI teams are going to struggle to be able to measure and demonstrate value. How many people have read Andrew Jacqueith's book Security Metrics? It's going back a few years, right? This is my dog-eared copy. I got it like right when it came out, and I always pull it off the shelf. There's a quote in there that I always loved, which is, "Metrics do not suddenly appear fully formed like Athena from the forehead of Zeus." So the point here is metrics are hard, right? This isn't easy. It's not something you're just going to go in on day one and say, yeah, here's our metrics. We know they're right, and we're going to start measuring them. It is a difficult journey, but it's an important one. And so I believe, again, having some sort of process in place to actually think about how you're going to improve the measurement of a CTI function is critical. The first is aligned to the evolved threat intel lifecycle. And the reason we say that is because if you are focusing on capturing the requirements at the very beginning of the lifecycle, and you do focus that and you invest time in it, then you're starting to bake measures of success into what you collect. Because if you're defining requirements with a stakeholder, you know what they're asking for, and you'll be able to go back and say, well, how am I going to measure that? How am I going to go have a conversation with them and demonstrate to them that that we were able to meet 80% of their requirements? And also, again, we have the feedback and validation stage, which again enables those communications. You need a continuous measurement approach, right? So again, defining metrics isn't a one and done. You're not just going to define some metrics and say, yeah, we're collecting those and that's great, and you pretend everything's wonderful. So you have to have kind of this continuous measurement approach. And you need to define metrics and measurement alongside the investments in the maturation of the CTI function. So again, we'll get to that last step, but to me, that's one of the ones that, again, I think a lot of organizations look at that and they struggle and they throw their hands up and say, no, we're not going to do it. So like I said, aligning to the evolved threat intel lifecycle, it's focusing on planning and direction. It's focusing on the feedback and validation steps right there. They're right next to each other. It's critically important that both of those are addressed, because if you get the planning and direction, reasonably right at the beginning, it gives you the opportunity to define some metrics and how you're going to measure things, and then you can go back to the stakeholders every quarter, every year, and say, the CTI that we produced for you, did it help? Did it make you more effective? Did it make your job easier? Were you able to, do something better because of that intel? And so again, those two are very critical there. So step 2, measurement is a process. So again, I like, Lean Sigma. This is the Deming cycle, which is, either plan, do, study, act, or plan, do, check, act, if you're familiar with it. Andrew Jacqueith in Security Metrics actually has most of this as a process when he talks about how do you actually implement measuring and metrics, and how do you sustain that over time. And so I think if you kind of put it into these boxes, it just helps make it a little easier. It is a project. It is a process that you have to implement and you have to sustain, and it does have to be repeated. So it's not just that one and done. You're going to identify and define the metrics. You're going to develop them. You're going to do some Q&A around them. You're going to produce them. You're going to go have that conversation with the stakeholders. You're going to find opportunities for improvement, and then you're going to go implement those changes, and you're going to repeat the process. And that process repeating is important because, one, there's improvements to be made, but two, it's just everything's changing so fast. And so, what a valid metric was, last year for a stakeholder may not be the same thing any longer. So you have to kind of keep up with the times. And the third one is maturing your metrics over time. I like to use the 2x2 box here because if you think about the X and Y axes in terms of how much value does a metric or a measure bring to you versus how much cost it's going to have, it allows you to kind of think strategically about how you want to do those metrics. And so when you're implementing a CTI function, the early days, you are not going to be aiming for the upper right quadrant. That's crazy. It's just, you're not going to be ready for it, and you have to acknowledge that. But if you do that, you can kind of think about, maybe some volume metrics are going to be good enough. They're maybe more operational type metrics. They may not be like strategic or leadership type metrics, but they're going to get you started. So you may want to be able to know like how many intelligence requirements we're tracking, or how many reports that we're producing, like how much work and activity is being done by the CTI team. And then as you get, again, into maybe that second level of maturity that we saw on the mountain, then you're going to kind of expand over into the lower right. Again, the goal here is to find cheap but effective metrics. And so you may start to look at, how many new incidents were documented because of the cyber threat intel that was produced. What's your false positive ratio, right? If I'm submitting indicators to the SOC, for example, I want to know, are we producing high fidelity threat intelligence, or are we giving them a bunch of false positives? Because if they're getting a bunch of false positives, I can guarantee you they're not going to be a happy customer. How many countermeasures were implemented? If we're starting to look at tactics, techniques, and procedures of the attacker, are we actually taking that information as we move into that kind of operational and tactical level intel, and are we actually putting that into effect? Did we actually go change some of the parameters around our EDR configuration, for example, or our firewall configs to respond to what the CTI team is producing? And then when you get into that higher level of maturity, now you're aiming for things, you're going to spend some time developing these metrics, but it's worth the effort to do that, right? So you can look at not just how many incidents CTI created, but okay, you can start to decompose those down into were they, the highest level of criticality down to the lowest. How many high value incidents are actually attributed to the threat intel that was created. How much effort are you saving because you're putting emphasis into automating the work that the CTI team is doing? So that's the 7 tenets of threat intel. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take those. I'll be around for a while. But thanks for your time.
Thanks for your presentation. It was really good. I really like it. The whole thing was very clear. Actually, it took me back to my 20 years in the army. There's a lot of challenges that intelligence is facing here, like you said, in CTI. The same that we're facing in the army. You know, and there is something that I was, I finished as a staff officer during my year, so I used to work in staff, and something was really helpful for us for trying to make the intelligence one of the principles that is a collaborative.
Yes.
It needs to be collaborative. It needs to be the opportunity principle is also very important. So what we normally do for that, for fixing that problem is put the intelligence team, they do their work, and we put within the other teams.
Teams, right.
We have an intelligence guy in the tactical operations center that here will be the civil operations center. We can have one in the planning team. We have, so there they have a common knowledge, and they're spreading their knowledge.
Yeah.
And also they are bringing
Yeah,
their
two-way.
current situational awareness. So I don't know, what do you think about this kind of trying to make this intelligence be part of everything?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, so in terms of this kind of intelligence-powered security operations idea, it is a high level construct, right? The point of putting it at the center of these activities is exactly that, right? It depends on the organization and right how many staff they have or how many resources they have. But I think if they make that type of investment, maybe it's a virtual alignment, there is an analyst who's more focused on strategic intel, and they're going to be aligned to the cyber risk management team, for example. I think that's, I mean, I think from putting it into practice, that totally makes sense. Whether it can be physical, like, actually physically aligning them and putting them in the same room if you want, or virtually aligning them. I do think that actually is is in the spirit of certainly of what that that model is trying to achieve. It is really finding a way to embed the intelligence, however you can do it, into those other functions where they basically, it just becomes a part of their processes. It becomes an element of what they're doing, because right now we don't see that collaboration happening. And I'll say I probably glossed over it. The planning and direction aspect of the intel lifecycle, that's certainly that, and the validation piece are I believe are the two linchpins that really do open up the collaboration aspects of it, because we do see that, right? It's the cyber threat intel team gets formed. They don't really have, I'll say, the right remit. Maybe they don't feel empowered to go out and have those conversations. And it's more of I think John Olczyk in his article referred to it as an academic exercise, right? We're producing intel because we produce intel, right? And it's not because it has utility, it has value. And so I think certainly focusing on those two aspects, and it's why we really promote those two pieces of the Evolve Threat Intel lifecycle, is to encourage more collaboration. If you're actually going out, identifying your stakeholders, and having a conversation with them and bringing them into the discussion and the agreement, that is an enabler. That makes collaboration happen, but it can't be a one-time thing, right? And that's why that validation piece is really important. You have to continue to have those conversations with them. So I wholeheartedly agree. Absolutely. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love that. Any other questions? I'll be around if you have any. Thanks for your time.